It's March the 17th, 1943. The silence of a dimly lit office is broken only by the faint hum of a flickering light. In a cramped room within the heart of the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the report in front of him. His hands shook as he clutched the document. His mind struggled to process the words he had just read. Impossible. It simply couldn't be true. The report was an intercepted message from an American agent in Mexico City, confirming something utterly unbelievable. Ford, the mighty American automaker, was churning out one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. That was a staggering claim. A 1.5 million part bomber, each aircraft built from scratch every hour, surpassing the capacity of Germany's entire wartime manufacturing efforts. Canaris' mind reeled as he struggled to reconcile this information with the beliefs that had been ingrained in him since the war began. Single B-24 bomber, an aircraft with 450,000 rivets, 30,000 components, and 18 tons of raw material, was coming off an assembly line faster than Germany could even assemble a simple military vehicle. The sheer scale of it was unfathomable, but Canaris had no choice but to believe it. The facts were too consistent, too irrefutable. In the same moment, Major Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz stood at attention, his face a mixture of disbelief and grave concern. He had double-checked the report, verified the numbers. It was true! The Americans were building warplanes at a scale Germany couldn't possibly match. Yet, as the report made its way through various channels in Nazi Germany, no one seemed ready to accept it. Canaris couldn't help but think back to 1941, when Luftwaffe General Karl Kohler had presented similar intelligence. A report from the German military attaché in Washington suggested that the Americans were capable of producing 2,000 aircraft per month. Hitler had dismissed it outright, laughing at the very idea. Americans are too weak, too disorganized, he had said. They are a democracy. They can't fight a war like we can. The arrogance of Nazi leadership was evident. They had underestimated the American industrial machine, convinced that the weak American democracy couldn't match the power and efficiency of the Nazi war machine. But here, now in the Abwehr headquarters, the truth was undeniable. Germany's downfall was being sealed not by tanks or fighter planes, but by something far less visible, the extraordinary power of the American industrial complex. As Canaris stared at the report, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if Germany had taken the Americans seriously earlier. Would they have been able to turn the tide of the war? Would the strategic miscalculations of the Nazi regime have been avoided? The scene shifts back to the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where the American production juggernaut was at full throttle. The assembly lines stretched on for miles, with workers, many of them women and minorities, working tirelessly, each one playing their part in an operation that could change the course of the war. While the German leadership remained locked in disbelief, across the ocean, the Willow Run plant in Michigan continued its relentless pace. The factory, sprawling over miles of land, was a feat of industrial engineering that no one, least of all the Nazis, could have comprehended. Ford had transformed its vast production facilities, originally designed for mass-producing cars, into a wartime production powerhouse. Inside Willow Run, the scene was nothing short of miraculous. The sound of machinery echoed through the cavernous factory halls, reverberating against the cold steel walls. The assembly lines were in constant motion, every worker knowing their exact role, performing repetitive tasks with precision. Women, who had never before worked in industrial environments, were now key players in the war effort. They installed hydraulic lines, riveted fuselages, and worked in unison with thousands of men, creating something extraordinary. It was a production line unlike anything seen before. Ford's vision was clear. They would produce bombers like they produced cars. Instead of workers swarming over an aircraft, the aircraft would move down the line, while stationary workers performed specialized tasks. This was mass production on an industrial scale, something that was beyond the comprehension of anyone who had not seen it firsthand. In fact, the efficiency of the Willow Run plant was so astounding that even its own workers were amazed. One former worker, who had helped assemble the B-24 bombers, recalled the pace of production. It was like a well-oiled machine. Every day, we just went to work and did our job. Nothing fancy, just punch in, build bombers, punch out. It wasn't just the workers who were amazed. Even outside observers were left in awe. The story of American industrial success spread like wildfire. Foreign diplomats, businessmen, and spies all had a chance to witness what was happening in Detroit. The plant was a beacon of hope for the Allied war effort, and a source of deep concern for the Axis powers. But despite the growing number of reports, photos, and even video footage from the plant, German leaders refused to accept the facts. When a Spanish diplomat, Colonel José Unría, visited Willow Run, he couldn't believe his eyes. He reported back to Germany that the plant was an industrial marvel, capable of producing more bombers in a month than all of Germany's factories combined. He noted the sheer scale of operations, the long assembly lines, the sophisticated machinery, and the enormous workforce that operated without flaw. Of the most striking aspects of Willow Run was the way it integrated diverse groups of workers, something the Nazi regime would have considered unthinkable. African Americans, women, and immigrants worked side by side, producing warplanes with an efficiency that shocked the world. It was a testament to the power of American democracy, a system that allowed people from all walks of life to contribute to the war effort. While German intelligence was slowly piecing together this information, the Nazis had already begun to dismiss the reports. Hitler's propaganda machine was quick to label the American success as a myth, a clever piece of Allied disinformation. The notion that a country known for its weakness could produce bombers on such a scale was too much for the Nazi leadership to bear. They clung to their belief in racial superiority and the efficiency of their own military-industrial complex, dismissing the evidence as mere propaganda. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Admiral Canaris, who had seen the reports and the photographs, struggled with the growing realization that the war was lost. His hands trembled as he sifted through the documents in his office. He could see the unfolding disaster, but the walls of the Reich were closing in on him. The stubborn refusal to accept the truth was a fatal flaw in the Nazi leadership, one that would cost them dearly. But there was still hope. If the Nazis could only recognize the scale of the American industrial effort, they might change their strategy. Yet the reality of the situation was becoming clearer by the day. Germany had underestimated the American production machine, and the consequences of that miscalculation were about to unfold in a way they never imagined. In early 1943, reports from every corner of the world confirmed the same shocking truth. The Americans were building warplanes faster than Germany could dream. The B-24, with its 1.5 million parts and 450,000 rivets, was rolling off the line every hour. And despite every effort to sabotage it, the American war machine kept turning out bombers at an unprecedented rate. By now, it was clear to anyone with access to the intelligence reports that the American war effort was going to crush the Axis powers. The United States, with its massive industrial capacity and relentless workforce, had the ability to sustain a war on two fronts, something that Nazi Germany, with its limited resources, could never match. But the war was far from over. The crucial turning point was still to come, and it would come not in the form of another battle or tactical maneuver, but through something even more powerful: the overwhelming might of American industry. By April 1943, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Despite all efforts to downplay or dismiss the facts, the overwhelming production capacity of the American war machine continued to accelerate. With the Willow Run plant alone capable of producing 650 B-24 bombers each month. That was more than all of Germany's aircraft factories combined. Yet, the Nazi leadership remained blind to the reality unfolding before them. In Berlin, even after receiving photographic evidence, reports from spies, and testimonies from foreign diplomats, the leadership refused to believe that the Americans could maintain such a rate of production. Despite all the data, despite the evidence, Hitler, Göring, and the rest of the Nazi leadership maintained that the numbers were lies, fabrications designed to demoralize the Germans. The propaganda machine churned out explanations to discredit the Americans and their miraculous industrial efforts. But it was becoming increasingly clear that the failure to accept the reality of American production was Germany's undoing. On April 20th, 1943, Hitler's 54th birthday, Canaris and Göring had a fateful meeting. Canaris, armed with photographs, intercepted documents, and reports from 17 independent sources, presented the irrefutable facts to Göring. He laid out the devastating truth. The Ford Willow Run plant was producing one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, and it had been operating at peak production since January. Göring, the Reichsmarshal, picked up the photographs disdainfully. "Do you take me for a fool?" he said, laughing derisively. "These are obviously wooden mock-ups. Propaganda. The Americans want us to believe they can build aircraft like sausages." He mocked Canaris further, dismissing the reports as false and claiming the actual production was far lower than reported. But Canaris knew the truth. He had seen the evidence with his own eyes. He had even smuggled footage of the assembly line operating at full capacity, showing bombers being built at a staggering pace. But still, Göring and the others refused to believe it, choosing instead to hold on to their misconceptions and their ideology. Weeks later, when Canaris was summoned to brief Hitler directly at the Wolf's Lair, the Führer was just as skeptical. "It's impossible," Hitler said. "The Americans are capable of mass production of simple goods, automobiles, refrigerators, but a bomber is not a car. It requires precision, skill, dedication. How can they have achieved this in just 16 months? Hitler's voice was filled with disbelief, but behind it there was an unspoken fear. General Jodl, standing nearby, attempted a calculation, stating that even if the figures were true, the production rate was exaggerated. The Americans could not possibly have the manpower, resources, or knowledge to produce bombers at such a scale, he insisted. It is a statistical impossibility. But the truth had already begun to show its face. The Willow Run plant was not only producing the B-24s at the claimed rate, but it was doing so with a workforce made up of both men and women from every walk of life. Women, many of whom had never worked in factories before, were trained in mere days to handle highly specialized tasks. It wasn't just a revolution in industrial production. It was a revolution in society. The diversity of the American workforce, the inclusion of African Americans, women, and other minorities shattered the very foundation of Nazi racial ideology. In November 1943, after months of German intelligence analysis, aerial photographs of Willow Run were obtained, confirming the staggering production rate. Yet, even with irrefutable photographic evidence, Göring continued to laugh off the reports. He dismissed them as clever American manipulation, a way to deceive Germany into thinking they were winning the war. Meanwhile, the war in Europe continued, and with every passing month, the gap between the American and German war efforts grew wider. The Allies had more aircraft, more bombers, more fighters, and more resources. The Germans, on the other hand, had fewer planes and increasingly worn-out factories that could no longer meet the demands of the war. By 1944, the situation was dire. The Americans, with their vast industrial output, were able to replace their losses with ease. By contrast, the Luftwaffe could not even come close to keeping up. The Allied bombing campaign was relentless, and as American bombers filled the skies over Germany, the Nazi war machine began to crumble. The failure of German intelligence to accept the truth about American production, to see the power of mass industrial production, and to understand the scale of the Allied effort was catastrophic. It had led to poor strategic decisions, wasteful resource allocations, and an underestimation of the enemy's capabilities. It wasn't just a failure of intelligence. It was a failure of ideology. On February 20th, 1944, the German leadership was finally forced to confront the reality of the situation. The American 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, sending more than 1,000 heavy bombers to attack German aircraft factories. In just 6 days, they dropped more bomb tonnage than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain during the entire Blitz. It was at this moment that the Luftwaffe's inadequacy became evident. Adolf Galland, a leading fighter pilot, reported seeing over 800 bombers in a single formation. "These planes are real, and they're dropping real bombs," he said, a stark acknowledgement of the power that the Allies had at their disposal. The tide of the war had truly turned. By June the 6th, 1944, D-Day was underway, and over 11,000 Allied aircraft appeared over France. The Luftwaffe could only muster 300 fighters in response. The Nazi war machine had been overwhelmed, not by the superior tactics of the Allies, but by their sheer industrial might. The inability of Germany's intelligence service to comprehend the scale of American production, their refusal to accept the truth, had cost them the war. In the years following the war, surviving German intelligence officers revealed the full extent of the failure. The intelligence had been there all along. They knew the truth. They just refused to believe it. As historian Dr. Gard Wienberg concluded, had this intelligence been accepted and acted upon, Germany might have sought peace 2 years earlier. Saving millions of lives, the lesson is clear. Ideology, when placed above reality, leads to catastrophic failure. The German intelligence services had gathered the information, but their leaders were too caught up in their beliefs to see the truth. It was a fatal mistake that led to the downfall of the Third Reich. At the dedication of the Yankee Air Museum in 1985, Rose Willow Monroe, one of the iconic Rosie the Riveters, met former Luftwaffe pilot Hans Rudel. "How did you build so many so fast?" Rudel asked. Monroe's reply was simple, yet profound. "Honey, we just went to work every day and did our job.